it's hard to say anything about it because not a single one of its silent films has survived. In fact, the earliest known unique production that does survive is an early talkie from about 33, I think. So we can't really say anything about what they did, except that if you look at the list of titles, it's pretty obvious that it was very commercially oriented from the very beginning. Star led a cartel of 4 other producers to gang up on Unique and force them out of the market. They issued an edict to cinemas to say, if you show films from this company Unique, we will not supply any of our films to your cinemas. In them days, there were not very many cinemas in China. What there was mostly scattered up and down the east coast, the Pacific coast of China. So the trading cities, the port cities, of which the biggest and most important was Shanghai. And so the cartel worked. It did what it was intended to do, which was basically effectively block Unique from most of the markets. Unique owned 1 or 2 cinemas of its own, we believe, but that was not enough to show films and get a return on them. So Unique had no choice but to look further afield. So in the late 1920s, Unique dispatched several of the brothers to Southeast Asia to set up businesses, film businesses, not for production but for distribution and exhibition in those countries. So the two youngest brothers, who later were known as Run Run and Run Mi Shaw, were sent to Singapore. And at that time, Singapore was part of Singapore, Malaysia, or Malaya rather. They were a united state at that time. And that meant that they were operating in both, and this is how the family came to acquire Malaysian honorific names. So Xiao Yifu, the youngest brother, became Run Run Shaw. They set up over the following years, interrupted of course by the Pacific War when the Japanese occupied most of these territories, they set up distribution companies and exhibition companies and established a very strong foothold in the Southeast Asian market to compensate for the lost China market. The second brother, who became known as Run Di Shaw, went to Hong Kong in the late 30s, and he set up a company in Hong Kong at that time called Nanyang, Southern Ocean, so Pacific actually it means. And that of course was also closed down by the Japanese occupation of Hong Kong and revived in the late 40s after the war. When it was revived, that was called Shaw and Sons. And Shaw and Sons subsisted in the Hong Kong film industry right through the 1950s, well into the 60s, and possibly even into the 70s, occasionally putting its name to co-productions. The most famous film it was ever associated with probably is a not very good film by Mizoguchi. In fact, it's one of his worst. He made a film called Yang Gui Fei, which is a Japan-Hong Kong co-production, and the Hong Kong end of the co-production is Shaw and Sons. The family couldn't help but notice that Shaw and Sons was not doing terribly well in the Hong Kong market, much less in exporting its materials, its productions, to the rest of the region. Because that market was conquered by another company, a bigger company, called Motion Picture and General Industries, or sometimes also known as Cathay. And in the mid-50s, Cathay was a giant. And it continued being a giant until its founder was killed in an air crash. So Shaw felt we're number 2, we're coming, quite far back, second in the market here. We need to do something about this. And the solution was to give up on the second brother, Run Di, and move Run, the youngest of the brothers, to Hong Kong to basically set up a new company in Hong Kong. He arrived from Singapore in 1958 and he established Shaw Brothers. As I tried to stress, with these solid connections across the region, most particularly in Malaya and Singapore. Malaya, of course, they soon separated and Malaya became Malaysia, as it still is now. But they also had tentacles reaching out into the Philippines and Thailand and other countries. They were the only Shanghai company that achieved this kind of market presence across Southeast Asia and indeed Northeast Asia, because they forged links also with Japan and Korea, South Korea. Not in production, but at that stage. That came a bit later. So Run Run is in Hong Kong from '58, running Shaw Brothers as a parallel company to Shaw and Sons, which still exists and run by his elder brother. And he gets going very spectacularly. His very first production in Hong Kong, which is called The Kingdom and the Beauty, is a big historical spectacle directed by Li Hanxiang, and it's a huge hit. And so he begins the fight back against Cathay and GI in the market. In 1961, using land which his elder brother had already bought, earmarked for development, in Clearwater Bay, which is in the northeast of the new territories in Hong Kong, he builds and starts running a film production centre called Shaw Movie Town from '61 till the mid-'80s, when it's eventually the studio system collapses at Shaw Brothers and the studios are turned over to TV production. But for something like 25 years, these studios are Shaw Brothers. They're the home of Shaw Brothers, and the great majority of films made by Shaw Brothers are shot in those studios. Run Run, fired with success, starts importing foreign talent to work on his films. He first turns to a number of Japanese cinematographers and directors, most of whom take on Chinese pseudonyms to work on their films. The feeling is that these people are technically more proficient, they have a more solid grounding in the technical developments of their art, in particular in colour cinematography, and Shaw thinks that this will enhance